Hello.
Hey, I believe we're live. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the People's Forum. If you're joining us in person or if you're joining us on the live stream, my name is Leanne, and I'm absolutely so excited to be introducing this book talk with our dear comrade Matteo Capasso and Karina Mullen for a talk on Matteo's latest book, Everyday Politics in the Libyan Jamahiriya. I won't say very much because I want to get right to the conversation, but I think for us it's incredibly important that we are studying Libya and also continuing to have Libya in the forefront of all of our conversations. We're right now in the middle of the latest intervention led by NATO that's right now happening in Ukraine, and there's a very interesting thing that happens, I think, in the US public consciousness that makes it so that we don't remember what happened even just a few years ago. And in 2011, one of the most brutal NATO-led invasions happened in Libya. The infamous words of Hillary Clinton, I believe it's "we came, we saw, he died," referring to the assassination of Gaddafi. And since then, Libya has been suffering from so much violence and unrest due to this NATO intervention and invasion. And the main discourse around the intervention in and of itself has characterized Libya as a completely authoritarian one-man state. And what Matteo has done with his book is he's completely countered this argument. The United States really loves to designate all of its enemies as 100% authoritarian and just leave it at that, oversimplify it, and make sure that's the only thing going on in all of our consciousness. And this book goes into the complexities of Libyan society and politics and features a multiplicity of Libyan voices to help us understand where Libya was at the moment of NATO intervention. And that's something that's very, very important. So if you haven't read the book, you can get your copy at 1804books.com or here downstairs at the bookstore. And in the meantime, please welcome Matteo and Karina for this conversation, and we'll be taking questions both from our audience online and in person after the conversation between the two of them. So thank you so much for coming, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Leanne.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Leanne, and thank you to the People's Forum for hosting this really important conversation, and thank you to Matteo for writing such an incredible book and for inviting me to be here in discussion with you. As Leanne said, this book is really, really important in terms of challenging the mainstream dominant approaches to studying Libya, to speaking about Libya, the Orientalist stereotypes that are so predominant in discussions about Libya that have to do with really, the political economy of academia, the distortions of the bourgeois capitalist media in this country, and your book really takes on those stereotypes, the Orientalist distortions, and the profound, really misunderstanding of intentional, really misunderstanding of Libya. So I think that's really important. And it provides us not only with an understanding of what, as Leanne was saying, of what happened in 2012 and with the U.S. NATO-led intervention, but also really the background of, I think it's really, you have a really profound historical analysis too of the sort of history of the Libyan revolution, the 1969 revolution, Fateh revolution, and its importance to anti-imperialist, pan-African, Arab nationalist, really revolutionary struggles across the globe, as you point out in chapter 2, and this is what of course gets Libya targeted by U.S. imperialism, the various groups that Libya under Gaddafi was supporting, from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Palestinian Liberation Struggle more broadly, the Irish Republican Army, the Polisario Front, various African, Asian, South American revolutionary groups, including the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So, this book is really important for sort of recovering that history, also helping us to understand why Libya was targeted by, and many ways continues to be targeted by U.S. imperialism. I just want to start by saying also just how really beautifully written the book is. I really appreciate that. Matteo gave me this book just about 2 weeks ago, I think, right before I was about to leave for a delegation to Cuba. So I didn't have much time when I was in Cuba to read it. And then I got back and was overwhelmed with catching up with work. So I had a day to read it. And most academic books you do not want to read in a day because they're dense, jargony, difficult to get through. And this book is so well written. It's so accessible. It's and at the same time profound. And it's really theoretically rich, empirically rich. I really, I love how you bring out through the interviews that you do with Libyan diaspora, Libyans living in Europe, how you really center the voices through these oral histories of Libyans to make sense of this history and the complex political, economic, geopolitical context. I really, as I said earlier, I really want to highlight in particular how important your book is in terms of taking on the Orientalist tropes about Gaddafi. And, really so much of this can be said, and I know you did in an article too, where you make a comparison with Venezuela, can really be said about any sort of global South states, heads of states that the U.S. Opposes, that are seen to threaten U.S. imperialism, capitalist accumulation in the global north. These tropes of authoritarian, dictatorship, quixotic, idiosyncratic, bizarre. Reagan, you say, referred to him as the mad dog of the Middle East. A so-called tent-loving dictator who travels with camels and virgin guards, or Libya as a stateless state. And as you point out, in addition to this is really the personalization of complex political, economic context, but also the caricatures, as you say, and this is your words, that function to simplify complex power struggles, exclude questions of political economy, and most importantly, attempt to master forms of political dissent by resorting to a banal and often dichotomous scheme of classification. And I really love the example, is just one example of many that you give, to try and bring in some of this complexity that is left out of the dominant approaches. When you talk about Gaddafi's visit to Italy in 2009, where he requested to meet 200 women in order to explain Islamic values. And this was so easily dismissed in Western media as an example of his misogyny or his idiosyncratic behavior. But actually, what you demonstrate through your discussion with your interlocutor, how you came to understand the deeper political significance of this visit and his actions while he was there, and how, you gave the example of how Mussolini, I believe it was in 1937, when he visited Libya and claimed to be a liberator of Islam, and, a protector rather of Islam, and he asked to meet with 300 Libyan women, and, in this colonial, really, demonstrating the cultural and also physical, of course, violence of colonialism inflicted on the Libyan people. So this is Gaddafi sort of speaking back to that history. Of course, none of the media picked up on this. I don't know of any academic texts that have. So I was really, I really found that example really interesting and telling and reflective of the insights that your book provides. So I would just like to ask a couple of questions to get us started and to generate a discussion, hopefully provide an opportunity for us to discuss some of the book's key contributions. So I'd like to ask, you to begin by discussing your methodology, because I think the methodology is really interesting and many ways unique for an academic text. The interviews and oral histories that you use, and how you also recognize your own positionality in relation to this.
Well, first and foremost, thanks to Layan and to you, Corina, for giving me this chance to talk about the book. I have to say that since I am not sure which it's like the chicken of the egg, since I published the book or I arrived at Colombia, but I've been bombarded by email and medias that they want to do series or TV shows about the tyrants and repression and carcerality in Libya, and so they come to me and they're like, we want your insight, and I don't reply. So, finally I can speak about what this book talks about, and it's a real pleasure. The other thing that I wanted to say, which I know you also, it's very dear to you, it's tomorrow. We've been having a series of hearings about sanctions. Tomorrow is going to be the one on Gaza. It's the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism. You can follow us on Twitter or through the website. Tomorrow the hearing is going to be on Gaza. There is no need why I need to say that tomorrow each one of you needs to be there, or if they have the chance to rewatch it. We all know what's happening, and we need to keep up the maximum pressure that we can on the Zionist entity, right now, in the future, and we will continue to do so. Thank you for this. Now, okay, the book, the methodology. Yes, so the story goes that when I was reading, obviously, it comes from my master's degree as well, that I worked on Libya. The more I was reading and the more I realized that there was this massive personification of anything to do with Libya. Libya is Gaddafi, Gaddafi is Libya. So it was really a mutual, interchange of the two. So in a bit of a sort of, the idea that pushed me to go through oral histories was the idea that basically there was nothing about the Libyans themselves, can we understand this, through a different method that does not necessarily look at the State Department narrative of Libya as being Gaddafi, so just focusing on Gaddafi. So in that process, I have to say that the oral histories were a revealing tool in the sense that they allowed me to get into details of things that I would have never thought and experienced. But at the same time, oral histories are also very limiting, because you can talk to as many people as you want, but sometimes not necessarily you are going to know the history of your own country. And that happens to me as an Italian, to anyone. So, in this process, what happened is that I learned about what people thought. And then I also was, they also pointed me to understand history themselves. But I was also researching through them the same history of the country. So I think that became an exchange in a way, more than one way of, just interviewing. This is what they're saying, so this is the truth. There was a process, and in that process there was a lot of interpretation of what these narratives they were talking about, and what mattered was not so much whether what they were saying is true or not, but in which dominant narrative they were going to fit. And that what really, and you can see also on many of these stories, you read the book, some of these stories, they don't make any sense, they're not true. I checked them, but they entered the narrative, a narrative which was either and that specific time when I did, because there is also a question of temporality here, that it was in 2014-15, there was the war was ongoing, so, and they were still divided in these two big camps of pro and anti, and so each one wanted to fit their own narrative, and so, it was, it has been really rewarding, but at the same time, I definitely cannot romanticize the use of oral histories as the only tool that allows you to go into the theme of politics.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and that's a really another really excellent aspect of the book is how you intertwine these oral histories with history, with other histories, and with a political economy analysis, bringing out as well, the sort of the geopolitical context. And I think situating these oral histories within those contexts is also really helpful for understanding. And I guess this is kind of connected to my next question, which is the role of the concept of everyday politics that is, of course, in the title of the book, and that you incorporate throughout, and how you sort of use everyday politics in a different way than some of the sort of the way that it's usually approached in Middle East studies. So your kind of Asaf Bayets or Lisa Wadeen's, who use the concept as a way to stress the agency of the subaltern. And it's not to say that you're not looking at the agency of the subaltern, but you're also looking at agency as something that is a construct itself, that is a product of other forces. So thinking about agency not as a sort of as something that explains, but as an independent variable, but as a dependent variable, something that itself needs to be explained. And this is how you bring in, the international, the structural context of imperialism, of capitalist modernity, and how these shape not just the political economy, but also how they shape the quotidian interactions and experiences of surveillance, of control, of corruption, as well as the affect and emotional states of the population, and even consumption patterns, which you talk about. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you understand this concept of the everyday and quotidian in your work?
It has been a journey. I mean, the book is really a journey because, as everything, it reflects also my personal intellectual journey into this. I started reading the works of people that later I found out they were working for the CIA, like James Scott, and I was really drawn into this kind of work, and I was trying to basically I was interested because the idea was, there are people who are fighting back the power structure. That's good, I was drawn into that kind of work. But then, once you start situating that kind of research vis-a-vis the global south, then you need to realize that the agency of the people, what people are trying to do, they're trying to survive. Again, we go back to how this kind of research fits into a certain dominant narrative. And so I basically found myself that I was doing a sort of historical material analysis, but without mentioning Marx, because nobody had ever made me read Marx. So, because I was trying to look at what was happening, but at the same time I constantly went back to history. Because I was like, okay, they're telling me about corruption, they're telling me about surveillance, but can we, for example, delink the surveillance that was happening at the quotidian level without, divorcing this from the years of sanctions, geopolitical threat of war? And so what I started seeing was that violence was coming from the top down to the bottom, and it took different shapes. And we need to provide an analytical explanation to that. If we start from the down through the agency, then we are going to miss what's happening at the top. And so this is what I was trying to do. And what does the everyday become into this process? For me, well, it has become really, it's I don't know, it's so rich in a way, because the everyday became sort of a plate of everything, because the everyday became a door. I see the everyday as a door. I entered the political door through the everyday, and which led me also to connect all these different levels of analysis, without which I think you're not able to understand much. If you disconnect them, you're just gonna have a partial picture. And I still think the book doesn't fully relay everything that it could have.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Matteo. Yeah, and I guess also another important concept that you use, and really connected to what you're saying about the multiple scales of power, really, that you're thinking through with this book, is this concept of alienation.
Yeah.
I think that's another really great concept that you bring in. And I was wondering if you can talk about the interaction between the various scales of power, domestic, regional, international, and how they have contributed to what you define as a loss of appeal of the ideological values and principles that had guided the revolution of 1969, and resulting in what you described as alienation, cynicism, and dissimulation in regards to the mechanisms, symbols, institutions, and practices of the state. Could you talk about, in particular, how the sort of international figures in this? Because so often, again, because of these Orientalist and highly ideological perspectives, that the focus tends to be on the person of Gaddafi.
Yeah, and in fact we have to go back to that, because any book that you approach on Libya is going to tell you that Libya has lived under 42 years of dictatorship or authoritarianism. Now, there is a periodization, obviously, in which, there is political change, and that's what the book tracks. The book tracks the kind of political change that led us up to 2011. So, in 1969, you have a revolution. You need to locate that revolution into a period where in West Asia, in Africa, there was a moment of decolonization. So, there is nothing absolutely new about this revolution. It comes maybe a little later compared to other states, but it was as progressive as any of the revolution that took place during those years. And that's where you see land reforms, the redistribution of wealth. That's where you see, really the women's, the government pushing for women to have arms, the people army. There is, all kinds of reforms are taking place for the people. At the same time, and then there is the regional solidarity being, being undertaken, meaning, we are arming all those groups, for example, military support to all those groups that align, that they are trying to fight US imperialism, as you mentioned before. Now, what happens is that, obviously, those, the international powers, the imperialist powers, did not sit back the moment Gaddafi and his revolutionary Command Council started to push this kind of reforms, including the renegotiations of the oil agreements with the oil corporations. So what happens is that you start having sanctions as early as in the 1970s on spare parts. Libyan students are not allowed to come to the US to study in specific sectors, education, technology, engineering, and all that. What happens is that if you have sanctions in the 70s, you have multiple military confrontation in the Gulf of Sidra, the bombing in 1986 by the Reagan administration of Tripoli and Benghazi. Then you have the 1992 multilateral sanctions by the UN. And in this process, what you see, also considering the massive limitations that a country like Libya was facing coming out of Italian colonialism to rebuild itself productively, and technologically. Consider that from the monarchical period, all the technology had been built by the British and the Americans. So the moment Gaddafi and the government decides to break from all this, they have to go to the Soviet Union, and that's not easy to restart a whole technological process on that front. So what happens is that with all these sanctions and the internal limitations that they were already facing, part of the elites, and I'm really summarizing brutally here, so that's the reason why I have to buy the book, but part of the elites decides to, I'm gonna use the word that must be used, to sell out. And it's basically, it's not worth it anymore. Why are we doing this? We are under so much pressure. Why don't we start opening up our country? Why don't we start, trying to gain from these moments of sanctions, for example? And what you see is that there is a class transformation. The military turned merchants, particularly during the sanctions period of the 1990s, because what you see is that they were the only ones having access to foreign reserves during that period. So what they do is that they start buying goods outside and bringing them in. And this creates the initial splits within the leadership, which eventually will become so crucial in 2011. And this was reflected, and really, I use the word, I took it from the economics, it really trickled down to the people, because that's when you start seeing cynicism, alienation. Like, why are we even studying ideas like the Green Book? It doesn't make any sense. If people are building their own, there was this famous area in Benghazi called Aj al-Dolar, where, you know, all the revolutionary, parts of the revolutionary committees that had been able to gain and wealth, they decided to build their own houses. In other words, you start seeing socioeconomic inequalities and class stratification. But at the same time, and this must be pointed out, never at the level of Tunisia or Egypt, because Libya never went that kind of, it did open up, but it never opened up to foreign capital to the extent that Egypt or Tunisia did. So what you're seeing, and that's, I think it's chapter 3 of the book, that there is all this kind of cynicism vis-a-vis the Libyan Thawriya, which were the revolutionary committees, that they were so central in the 80s, but by the 90s and the 2000s, they were called the fat cats, because they were the ones that they were stealing the money, they betrayed the revolution, and so the revolution starts, it loses meaning itself vis-a-vis the eyes of the people. And, you know, alienation, it's something that we are so used in a place like the US, but you know, it's because it was a different system, you know, that the transformation was very different, it took place, but you can see that the moment, you know, metaphysical narratives are employed to explain things, this kind of constant conspiracy theory about, for example, even Gaddafi himself, that they cannot explain anymore the political change. They are like resignated to what is happening, but they are seeing that some people are getting wealthier. That's where you start creating really a sort of discourse of delegitimation vis-a-vis the government. And that's, you know, but as I said, all this took place under multiple sanctions, geopolitical threat of war. And it's not been easy to connect all this level of analysis, obviously.
Yeah, thanks for that. And, you know, as you were speaking and you were talking about a little bit earlier in your comments about the sort of radical transformations that were taking place in the late 70s before this sort of infitah, an opening, neoliberal, you know, even in relation to Egypt and Tunisia, much less, as you pointed out, but the sort of beginnings of that. You know, I just want to sort of go back to that and think about, you mentioned how, in a way, you know, what was different about the political and economic project of Gaddafi, not just in terms of is internationalism, you know, the Pan-Africanism, the Pan-Arabism, or Arab nationalism, but also, you know, abolishing private property, getting rid of, you know, workers taking over the means of production, and how he facilitated the workers taking over factories, getting rid of the wage, the land reform. You know, this was, you know, what was different, I guess, from the other examples from the region is that it happened later. It happened in the late 70s rather than the late sort of 50s and 60s. And then, you know, so I was thinking about this question of time and sort of being out of sync with time in a way. And this question is a little unfair because it requires sort of a lot of speculation, but I wanted to ask, because, you know, you point out, rightly so, about what Libya, you know, what Gaddafi was in the Libyan state was doing in the period sort of immediately preceding the US-led NATO intervention. And its role in trying to strengthen the institutions of African unity, for example, such as his support for the launch of the first African-owned communication satellite, plans for the launch of a Pan-African currency, monetary sovereignty. You know, this makes me think also how he was sort of temporally out of sync, but this time kind of ahead of his time, right? What would have been like at this moment, in the moment of, the emergence of a multipolar world order or polycentric world order?
That's right.
What do you think that Gaddafi or Libya would have fared better in the current context? And how did the unipolar moment that these projects were pursued under affect the outcome?
That's a great question, Corinne. I mean, again, it is. I mean, you have to go through, which is something I've been doing with my recent research, to the CIA documents and see how Libya is described to really understand that. I mean, mainstream academia, they're either all CIA agents or they really don't question the mainstream narrative, because it's really like, why 42 years of authoritarianism? It does not make any sense. Why? Because what you see is that in the early years, there is a pan-Arab strategy, which is being pushed relentlessly, sometimes even too much. You can see, it's trying hard. The government is trying to push for the liberation of Palestine. They're trying different Arab unions, unity projects, and then slowly, as the sanctions come, there is the realization on the side of the government that, and also that you cannot use violence anymore. So they stop militarily funding groups and they switch to the discourse of human rights. In fact, it is interesting that Gaddafi created this, with a little bit of self-indulgence in that, the Gaddafi Human Rights Peace Prize, which was given even to the Kwame Ture or Vernon Bellecourt from the AIM. He continued to build connection internationally. There was always there was always a logic in what was happening. What happens is that under the sanctions, Libya finds cornered. Most of the Arab states have basically renounced to the project of Arab unity. So you have either Iran, which is also under sanctions, or the African states. And that's where you start seeing that the government tries to come out to break from the embargo of the sanctions through the support of the African states. And that's where you get to the 2000. I think, with all the contradictions that were taking place at the level of the project of African unity, when you just start looking at the fact that there was a railway which the Libyan government was trying to build on the sea coast, and half of the project was going to be built by the Chinese, and half of the project was going to be built by the Russians. And then you start seeing the unfortunate emails of Hillary Clinton, where they say that, there was a plan to build monetary sovereignty, to try to build also, military independence of Africa. Whether or not these projects, and to which state they were, we don't know. But what we know is that Libya was trying to reinvest this money regionally, and was not only trying to send money abroad. Partly, yes, but also regionally. It was really a multipolar moment. And in that, it's interesting your question, because I really think that in a moment like this, that project would have thrived. But in the unipolar moment, and I think this is where 2011 it's important, and I'm sure, because it's not just about the destruction of Libya, it's also an attempt by the counter forces to regain, to recontrol, to recolonize one more time, to destroy a country, to try to, we can't let this go. With all the contradictions, obviously, like that there were taking place. But I would absolutely agree on that. In this current moment, yes. I think there was a vision there that not everybody had been able to build. Most likely China, and we're seeing this happening right now. But for Africa, definitely the Libyan leadership had been able to push something different in that moment, with all the internal contradictions, obviously, which are always there.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. Yeah. And I just want to move slightly back to the question of positionality and thinking about yourself as a researcher in relation to this, to your case study, the everyday politics in the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. You conclude in your conclusion. I really appreciate. the whole book is amazing, and definitely everyone here watching, make sure to purchase it. But I really like this sort of reflectiveness of the conclusion. And in it you write, when I began wondering how to formulate a solidarity-based response to events of such extraordinary magnitude in countries of the global south, I became conscious that knowledge of the other cannot and will never be enough. We are not ready, first and foremost, to understand the historical role and economic interests that our governments have in shaping those narratives about them. Can you discuss the concept of radical solidarity that you say is sort of necessary in order to fully grasp the role of our governments in creating the context in which you so wonderfully describe in your book?
I think, I don't think eventually I didn't develop the concept as probably one is reading and is trying to think, what is he trying to say here? But I think it really reflects my intellectual journey, because what happens is that I could track all these nuances that brought to the discontent towards the government internally. At the same time, there was so much pressure coming geopolitically towards Libya. But then you reach 2011. And 2011, there is no way around it. It's pure violence. It's NATO. It's NATO. It's a destruction of the country. There's, you have French philosophers coming, pushing for, liberation via NATO and all this. It just does not make any sense. And I could reflect that in the last chapter of the book, the one before the conclusion, where I could see the violence between Libyans themselves when I was interviewing. There was these two camps defined by the Tahalib and the Jourdan, which, it was like the algae, that they stick to your body, they are greens and they are pro-regime, and the Jourdan, which are the rats, which are the so-called rebels on the other side. And they really struggled to talk to each other. They struggled to talk to each other because, there was, if you think about it, it took, the 17th of February, by the 18th of March, they were bombing. It was a 1 month. There is no way around this. There is really no way around this to tell me that this was a revolution and needed all this amount of bombs to get the job done. Unfortunately, this became, and that's when you have to historicize all that happened, because there was a constant violence on the country, and 2011 became a moment which was exploited to have a regime change operation and to let the country, in the state in which it is right now. So what happens when I am writing and I'm trying to understand is that that's where my research and that's what I think I'm doing now is, how can we stop this NATO intervention? How can we understand this? And unfortunately this goes in everywhere right now. I mean, NATO has become a keyword now in our everyday life. And so in that moment, what I felt was, you can explain as much as you want Libyan society, but ultimately, you need to be able to speak back to the dominant narrative. And you need to be able to use the nuances of that society to speak back to the dominant narrative. Otherwise, willingly or not, you're going to end up reproducing that dominant narrative. So I think that was, what I felt that became an imperative for me then to basically say, okay, all these beautiful nuances of a society, which is normal in any kind of society, why NATO?
Indeed. Yes. So I have a couple more questions, but I think maybe at this point it would be a good idea, should we open it up to the room, and if there are any questions?
Thanks, Corina.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to read the book. I had a question about your interlocutors. You were talking in the beginning about your interlocutors, and I was just curious how you approached them, what types of questions you asked, how they reacted to your questions. And it's really fascinating that you discussed how you were more interested in sort of the filters or the sort of going beyond the truth value of what they say, but rather about interpolating yourself into their stories and sort of understanding where they're coming from and what that reflects back to you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Should I? Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to take a few? Or?
It's up to you. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Should I go?
I think we have also one online.
Okay.
You can go ahead and answer this one for
Thanks,
now.
Yeah. First and foremost, I have to say that most of the people that I interviewed, they were not necessarily diaspora, in the sense that when I think about diaspora, I think of people that have actually relocated elsewhere, and they decided to leave the country. What happened instead is that I found people mostly that they were in this sort of liminal state, that they didn't know what to do with themselves because there was a war happening in the country. So by 2014-15, many of them were studying, for example, or trying to find a job, and many of them actually went back to Libya by after my research. Some of them even died because of the war in Libya afterwards. So and they were mostly of an extraction that I would say they were between working middle class. I hardly interacted with people with of an upper echelon or class. What I've been trying to do was gradual, obviously, as you can imagine, because when I started talking about my research, which was about the past, because I didn't want to go into 2011, I thought maybe it's not the case. But then what I discovered is that it was better to delve into 2011 because everybody wanted to talk about that. I was asking about the past, and the first answer was locating them, positioning themselves vis-a-vis 2011. And then going back, you could go back slowly. So, for example, I started opening up with, did you expect what happened in 2011? And that allowed them, most of them, to feel comfortable because they would position immediately themselves vis-a-vis the events and then slowly going back. But you could see that violent positioning in 2011 did not reflect then when you go back, because when you go back you start also seeing actually things were not that bad, but 2011 you needed to position yourself. So this is it's a political moment inevitably that it was very powerful. And and on the truth value, it's important for me because and I think as a practice of research, one could say, did you betray your interlocutors? No, I actually got into a fight with most of them because I was like, but it didn't come from the beginning because it's a political process, even the process of interpretation. That's the way I see it. Ideologies everywhere. You can't just give me an objective truth. You're going to provide a political understanding of what would happen. So when I was told, and that's chapter 4, when I talk about capitalist modernity coming into Libya, where people start desiring consumer goods. And that's when the country is under sanctions. So there is a desire for example, for Dubai. They want Libya to turn, to become like Dubai, like the Gulf. And I'm like, okay, you are, your ambitions, your aspirations are orbiting around Dubai, but do you know what it means to be like a Gulf country? Geopolitically, that means also being aligned much more with, for example, with the Western project, U.S. imperialism. Some of them understood, the point, and we had a discussion. Some others were like, the government is the first one who's betraying us, so why should we not aim for that? But so again, it was a political discussion that needed to. It wasn't an interview. At some point you need to step up in the field, and you need to have your own opinion as well. I hope that I relate that in the book, obviously, in the way I interpret the events, and I'm sure many of my interlocutors are not going to be happy with this, but it's I think that's what I say, there isn't a truth, there is politics.
Thank you.
Well, first and foremost, I just want to thank you. I've been bothering Leanne for a long time about when the book was coming, because when I saw it announced, I was like, what? Someone's talking about Libya? It's an amazing fact, because at the time, of course, you know, and as you know, in 2011, we were so isolated trying to oppose the NATO intervention. So it's so welcome to see someone doing this historical work. You know, one of the questions you sort of intimated this in one of your early answers, is the relationship between, just for lack of a better word here, sort of the neoliberal politics of a certain period to 2011. Yeah. And I'm curious your thoughts about how these various splits in the state did play out in that context, because I can remember at the time it seemed so shocking how quickly things seemed to sort of collapse, given, you know, what many of us knew about Libya, and, you know, they had the 1 million person demonstration. So it was obvious the government had some support. So I'm curious your thoughts about how those sort of different state elements played into the ability of NATO and these other forces to move in so quickly.
Thanks, Eugene, and thanks for the work you do. Obviously, I'm a big fan, and it's I mean, there is a premise to that question, which is no matter the internal contradictions, a month was enough for NATO to intervene. So we have to start from there, in the sense, and I'm saying that why? Because it took a month to make a resolution about the fact that Gaddafi was going to wipe out Benghazi. We don't know if that was actually happening, you know, most likely not. There were no evidence of that. There are now, that's the beauty of history at the same time. The fact that now we know that all this fascination with African mercenaries was literally propaganda. So, I mean, and there are many other details that we now know. What we definitely know is that, although at the same time, as you were saying, is that there was discontent. There were splits. There was part of the elites, which, you know, the literature, or most of they call them reformers. And you can see this gradually happening since the 1990s. There is, for example, a beautiful magazine called La, meaning no, in which you can start tracing how ideas of privatization and critique of corruption increases among the intellectual elites, for example. And they're more and more like, you have betrayed the revolution, but in betraying the revolution, they're not calling back for more radical socialist, measures. They are looking at the West for a solution. And you see this in the curricula. Economics becomes one of the most important things. At the level of education, you see that most of the Libyans were studying abroad. They were going in the UK, Canada, and studying this, very neoliberal mainstream subjects that obviously they come back and they want to apply. That is a sort of a cultural domination that is taking place. So the government lost track of these things. It's clear, you can see that. And there was certainly a split within the elite, and many of those that transitioned on the side of the revolution, of the civil disobedience in that moment, they were so comfortable, and it comes back also in the book that I forgot to mention, to accept a NATO intervention. Because there is a sort of, the West is going to solve our problems. And that was, this is where you really need to be careful. You need to know your own history, your own place in history, and understand that there has always been a relationship of unequal exchange and domination vis-a-vis the West, and the West is not going to save you. So the extent to which did that play, it was definitely it was exploited. There were contradictions, there are no doubt, and contradictions also that had to do with the system that was becoming increasingly, and I talked about this in chapter 2 of the book, also surveilling people. There were a lot of reports. People were all constantly reporting on each other for stupid things as well, very quotidian things. So there was a mistrust vis-a-vis the government. But you could say the same about this country. How much distrust there is about this country. But NATO is not going to come in 1 month to wipe it off the earth. So, that is where the key then became, and that's where, to the radical solidarity point, there is a relationship of domination, and, it was exploited. I don't know if I replied. I went into a rant, I think. Yeah.
We have one from online, if I can ask it. What kind of general response from media or scholars, or particularly from the Libyan diaspora, have you received about the book? How has it been received, and what has people's perception been?
I think this goes back to what I said initially. Since the book has come out, and I don't know, maybe since I joined Columbia, I don't know, because it's a very elite institution, I've been receiving emails about students and the BBC, and other media outlets wanting me to consult about Libya, and especially about Gaddafi. I mean, seriously, yesterday I received this email about they want to do a series about tyrants. And they're lumping Stalin and Mao with Mussolini and Gaddafi and Hitler, and I'm like, all right, sounds like the EU. So I was like, I don't know. It's that has been the response. Carcerality is another thing. Everybody's interested about how many people the Libyan government was jailing. And these students are sitting in the US. I would really encourage them to study how many people the US is jailing. This does not mean that there should be in any time and any place any romanticization of anything. Whether it's Libya, it's Cuba, it's China or anything. We always need to be sharp in our critique, but at the same time, we need to be very careful in the way we approach certain things. So that has been the engagement so far, but there's been another engagement as well. So.
Just following up, if I may, on Eugene's question as well, and your response to it, and this, thinking about the kind of contradictions that exist in any society, right, as you're pointing out, and more so, of course, in capitalist core belly of the beast. But I since we're both involved in the People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, unilateral economic course of measures, I want to think about the impact of sanctions as part of this kind of hybrid war on Libya, and how really they're designed to both exacerbate as well as exploit contradictions, and in particular in the neoliberal era, in terms of facilitating privatization, corruption. If you could talk a little bit about that context, the context of imperialism, and particularly around sanctions.
No, it's this is actually something that I am now researching much more at the present moment. In fact, there is a paper on this that it's coming out on, especially on sanctions on Libya, and it's important to understand sanctions, because when we think about sanctions, we tend to the first point is that we tend to single them out, which is important because we also need to understand the specific effects that sanctions have economically towards a country. But at the same time, when we talk about sanctions, we cannot talk about just sanctions. We have to talk about the fact that while Libya was under sanctions, they were funding an opposition group, the MI6 or the CIA. Sometimes Libya was directly bombed under sanctions. So it's always a combination. That's why the word hybrid war makes much more sense of what the imperialist arsenal, is trying to create or to do. Now, specifically on sanctions, the sanctions vary in Libya because they affect the country in different times, and also they change according to the changes of the global system. For example, as I said before, in the late 70s, early 80s, what you see is that the US government imposes unilateral sanctions, and they're mostly related to spare parts in key technological sectors, oil and aviation especially. Now, why oil? I don't have to tell you why it's important for Libya. Aviation is crucial because Libya did not have a specialized manpower, and so all the or those with advanced skills in certain sector needed to be brought in, or many goods needed to be brought into the country to planes. If you block the aviation sector, you are targeting a key sector there. And you can actually you can see this also being discussed at the UN level. When it comes to the 90s instead, that's way more targeted and dangerous, because it is true that the sanctions on Libya did not have an effect like, let's say, Iraq, where Madeleine Albright was so happy to, slaughter Iraqi children for the sake of US foreign policy. That does not happen in Libya, luckily. But at the same time, what you see is a complete a war on currency. The fact that the country cannot access foreign reserves basically reduces the value of the Libyan dinar, which skyrocketed, and the inflation reached up to 55%. That means that for everyday ordinary people, goods become less accessible inevitably. And this is only something that countries, that have a certain power in terms of currency and foreign reserve can do. I mean, and again, it's interesting to think of this because Libya falls under the sanctions during the so-called UN sanctions decade in the 90s, where sanctions worked on so many countries. Think about Sudan even today, Libya, Iraq, Somalia, you can go on this. But that's what creates also is, this kind of black markets. So, and again, what I was saying before is that you create the space to either for those who have access to foreign currency through political power, and in that precise case they were the revolutionary committees, to buy goods from outside and bringing them in. Now, inevitably, this creates, a situation, as I said, of socioeconomic inequalities, but also it affected the military, for example. These sanctions also affected, the possibility of, again, spare part refurbishing certain sector of the militaries that they could not have access to a certain amount of, to specific type of weapons, and things that, all took place during the sanctions. So sanctions are... And finally, the moment you have an ideological switch from a certain type of progressive policies, those who are going to pay are going to be the lower classes inevitably. So what you see under the sanctions, they say sanctions didn't work because Gaddafi stayed in power. Sanctions worked perfectly well because they created a class stratification in society, which was way less before the sanctions were imposed. That's my argument, that I try to make here, and also I'm doing right now.
Hi, Matteo.
Hi.
That's it. Thank you very much. That's all extremely exciting, and I learned a lot. I still have this question. I find Libya an immense paradox compared to any other country that had faced intervention in the Middle East or elsewhere. We had other countries that have been the subject of either direct or indirect intervention, Syria and elsewhere, Egypt, there is a long list. But if anything, you mentioned that, but I still find it extremely paradoxical that Libya, whereas all the other interventions had created, especially in the left, in the Western left, protests, reactions, the war against Iraq, even Afghanistan, brought people out in the millions, Libya was perhaps the only place that even, academics on the left, whatever that means, signed off on the non-fly zone immediately.
Yeah.
And we're talking about people, at SOAS and so on, yes. and others who are supposed to be on the left. So I find it also fascinating and, of course, disturbing. Yeah. Also, given the fact that Libya, as you said, is the place where there is the cradle of many ideas that, of course, remain at the level of ideas, perhaps, the dollarization that now are becoming very, very fashionable. and also historical support for liberation groups. So it's not your typical, let's say, authoritarian state that had very clearly supported its own, closed interests, like let's say Syria or Saddam, with Saddam being, changing sides and so on. But it had a very committed anti-colonial, anti-imperialist tradition. And nonetheless, which makes it, I think, even more paradoxical, the fact that all of that was forgotten within a month and people signed off on practically the intervention. So how do you explain that? And if I may, to add on this question, that has to do perhaps with how radical solidarity networks perhaps don't work, or maybe what does it tell this about our solidarity networks and how these states or these places need to build on networks of information, of building confidence, building actually networks of knowledge, of cooperation, of exchange. Cuba has them, for example, and through that, nobody could dare, who never knows, attack Cuba. But I'm saying, this is what happens. You open up to the world. There's a different form of infitah, that infitah, that you open up actually to networks of intellectuals, and then you introduce this discussion. But it seems that Libya didn't have that. Is that part of of the answer to the question?
It's a very poignant question, and you can't get around that question, unfortunately. I don't know. I think that then this is why I love the historical materialist tradition in a way, because history, the weight of history, and it's missed when we are thrown into Twitter or into the speed of social media, for example, where we need to have an opinion or we need to explain something, and it's really like we tend to forget history. When we go back to 2011, certainly there were, Corina knows better than me, there were protests in Tunisia, there were protests in Egypt, where they simply, acting out of, okay, then, the famous domino effect, we need to get everybody out, so Libya was easy, but then at the same time, and this is where I said before, particularly when it comes to academic work on Libya, and it's really baffling because the demonization, you need to pick up any English written book on Libya. It's absolutely, it's out there. It's written, the Libyan government has never been taken seriously for nothing. And I face this, and I have to say it since, nobody's gonna watch this anyway, but it's incredible how, even when you send something for review, if I tell you the story of the review of this book, I was called the Gaddafi apologist initially because I sent it to a major UK publisher. Or the author should be grateful that NATO, because otherwise we wouldn't have this book right now. Two things then. One is academics can be very useless. And second, I think there was certainly a disconnection on that front, and it needs to be rebuilt. Absolutely. There was absolutely a lack of understanding, a lack of solidarity groups, and I think the Middle East, when it comes, even Palestine is saturated of solidarity, still there is no clarity. And this, needs, that's why we need a much more a clear vision on the kind of solidarity group that are created. And I think Libya had that very much in the 80s. It was on the forefront. It's something that I'm exploring right now when I go into the archives, the kind of stuff that they've done. It was beautiful. I found that they created Al-Mathaba Al-Alamiya, the World Center. They were inviting people from all over the world. Where the African Socialist Revolutionary Party, which recently some people have been banned or arrested because they are pro-Putin, according to the US State Department. But anyway, it was certainly. And on those academics that so easily can sign a no-fly zone, I don't have an answer. I mean, it's clearly, again, there is there is the willingness maybe to have a certain type of publicity, so you accept to do this kind of things, but you really don't think, then you're not even an academic. I mean, you are an academic, you are an intellectual bureaucrat. I think, but yeah.
And I think just sort of following on from that, you know, the kind of ideological confusion that academics participated in around Libya really marked also a turning point in the anti-war movement in the imperialist core. And we see the ramifications of that continuing till today. You know, and I think that, you know, it's a really important time to sort of go back to and think about what happened. And I know in your work here and also in another, the article where you look at Venezuela and Libya, you talk about how this kind of demonization really paves the way for intervention. So, you know, maybe you want to say some words about that too.
No, I mean, there is, you know, as we were saying before, the ideological ideas are connected to the material structure inevitably. So, you know, it's the dominant ideas tend to reproduce a certain type of mode of reproduction of economic system, you know. So when, what was interesting when I started working on Venezuela was that Chavez was described in the same thing. Is I mean, there is, I don't remember now the words in Spanish, but you know, like he was a general, authoritarian. Instead of tribes, they would refer to the slums of Venezuela, and you can see this kind of you know, similarities, which then come to inform or are at the basis of these foreign policy decisions. And it's, you know, and this is, but on Libya, I think, and this is where I think there is another important point. And anyway, it's so true. The fact that there was no anti-war movement, and still now we are having a problem to discuss anti-war movement. But I think it is really a key moment because it seems to me that that was a moment where we normalized the use of war. And in fact, after Libya, you got a huge split on Syria, and now it's happening again. And I think, you know, this is where it's really hard to bring all the different contradictions together, but we are living under war constantly. War is, you know, Sudan. It's everywhere. War. I think there's been a normalization, which I'm not going to get into that, but I really believe, and this is the work of Ali Qadri, who's an Arab thinker, is very important. Tells us that you know, capitalism has reached a point where it can only continue to reproduce by destroying. And specifically Western capitalism, and it creates it generates conflicts, and what are we going to do with these conflicts? We need to curb this situation. So yeah. Great. Thank you.
There's a question online that you actually, I think, is very related to this discussion, which you've already answered, but I'll read it just in case you want to add anything else to it. How do you think the right to protect Security Council decision in 2011 affected the perceptions built around Syria? So this is sort of following up on the thread
I mean,
now.
It's obvious that the decision of China and Russia completely differed when it came to Syria. There was an attempt in Syria anyway to reproduce the Libyan logic of creating a transitional council and all that. But I have to say something, because otherwise it looks like that every time we've been having this discussion over and over. The fact that recognizing that there has been a systematic and historical attempt by foreign forces to destabilize the sovereignty of countries of the south, like Syria or Libya, does not mean or does not mean wanting to discount the internal contradictions present into the country. You know, it's not that, but at the same time, you need to be really careful to allow the internal contradictions to become a door for, what then becomes the destruction of the national sovereignty. And we've seen that in Libya so perfectly. With they said no troops on the ground, the MI6 was there, Qatar was there, UAE was there. And there is a beautiful article by Patrick Higgins that we recently, published a special issue on imperialism, where he works around Syria, and it shows that the same contradictions, opening up of the country, immiseration of the working classes, but this took place under years, decades of US attempts of trying to destabilize the country. How are we going to reconcile these things? Through a NATO intervention? It's hard power as well. So when the moment Russia intervenes, it's not ideal, but at the same time it's putting a stop to something. It's the reality of the world. I mean, it's.
And maybe we can, two questions I'd like to, perhaps if we're transitioning to the end, to think about. One is, talking about Ali Qadri and waste as accumulation, destruction as accumulation. To what extent, could you maybe say a few words about contemporary Libya, and to what extent this also reflects that process of accumulation through waste?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think we see this on different levels when it comes to Libya. Basically, the underlining idea is that waste is a sphere. It's not just something that capitalism generates, like as a side output, but it's part of the production process. So what happens in the case of Libya is that what we're seeing is that Libya has become a market for waste, meaning violence, militarism, and all kinds of form. And in this market, this is what's scary, at the same time. And this is where the chaos can generate something positive, or can bring us to the edge of the death completely. And this is where, the anti-war, I think, is so crucial in that point. Because you're seeing that all parties in Libya are dependent on foreign patrons, and they're receiving all weapons, all kinds of weapons. And it's not just anymore the US, it's everybody. Now, in that struggle, maybe something different can come. But when you see that, even if you take Sudan is directly connected to the fact that Sudanese mercenaries were fighting for Haftar coming through the south of Libya. At the same time, now Haftar is now providing weapons to the Janjaweed. And then you have the UAE and the Gulf that are providing weapons to Haftar and also to the Janjaweed. And then, what you're seeing is that, forget about now for a second the conflict per se. Think about economically of this. Who's making money out of this? What is the main way to make money and to reproduce a certain cycle of capital? Is by selling weapons, by destroying, by recreating, by fragmenting. The more you create different groups, the more you have a chance to fund them. This is where war needs to be stopped. This is why I think the anti-war is so crucial, theoretically and materially, to our own world. And the same is happening in Ukraine. It's again, we need to see that happening in a way that we shouldn't be thinking, because I know this is can I go a little bit on a rant? You can see that with migration. The left replies with the moral question. They are dying at sea. That's not an analytical explanation. Why are they dying at sea? And what are you going to do analytically to counter that? You can't just come as an emergency situation, they are dying, we need to help them. No. You bombed their country. You have strangled them with your death neoliberal policies. They want to leave their own country. So you need to you need to first provide yourself an analytical explanation to why this is happening. Then you will eventually realize that you need to change your economic policies, your domination of the South, and also create something better than border infrastructure surveillance technologies. The same thing, you cannot expect that you only intervene in the moment of war. The moment of war is the moment where everything changes. That's too convenient. There are sides, and I think China, in the case of Ukraine, has laid out the best plan, because it's trying to recognize, I said I was going to go in a rant. It's trying to recognize that yes, there is a violation of sovereignty of Ukraine. That's not acceptable. But at the same time, there are security concerns that Russia has and you need to bring to the table. And you can't just dilute the whole thing to a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It's clearly geopolitical. We find ourselves in a geopolitical situation because otherwise, there is I was looking at Borrell this morning. He said, people tell me they want peace, but what kind of peace do you want? Basically, you want to stop supporting the Ukrainians? This is, what kind of logic is that? Do you want to stop supporting the Ukraine? I want the Ukrainians to be slaughtered? No, I don't want that. And neither I want the Russia. But it's really the currency that we are using to explain the events that does not make sense, and we are blocked because we think in moral terms as an emergency. Unfortunately, people are dying. Look at Palestine. Nobody gives a hoot about what's happening. But we go over and over about the same issue. Sorry, I went on a rant.
Not at all. Sure. A brilliant rant, and this is why we need more intellectual production from you. So moving on to our last question.
Okay.
What are your next projects? What are you working on?
So the next project is very confused, I have to say, but there is one thing that is connected to the book, which is unfortunately NATO, as part of this, I'm going to use the word crusade on Libya, has destroyed the archives. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is to recover the archival part of Libya, and especially the international connections that they were taking place under the Jamahiriya. So I'm looking, for example, at Libya, the connection with the American Indian movement and the Palestinians, and I'm trying to see how this played out, the conference that they were organizing, the intellectual production around that. And, scattered around the globe, actually, there is a lot of things. I traveled a lot in this country because, unsurprisingly, the CIA or whatever, the State Department was actually, microfilming a lot of this. The other part is that I am more and more interested in covert operations and the possibility of rethinking Europe in a different way. And when I talk about that, I mean rethinking Europe beyond the history of NATO expansions and trying to think that Europe, certain political possibilities in Europe were foreclosed right after the Second World War, up to the 70s, and if Europe starts to learn its own history vis-a-vis the South, they are going to realize that there is so much in common. And so that is the project that I'm trying to build, trying to imagine things differently, which, I think this is just a waste of time considering what's happening in the world, but,
We look forward to it now.
Yes, excellent. Thank you so much. And again, everybody, get the book. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Corina and Matteo, for this really amazing conversation. And if this didn't convince you to read the book, I don't know what will. And hopefully this is just the first of many conversations we can have with you to get deeper in our understanding of both Libyan history and the current moment. I think this would be very helpful to all of our political education programming here at the People's Forum and for everyone who's watching across the world. So thank you very much for joining us today, and hope to see you soon. We have many more events, so please, before you leave, if you're online, check our website, and before you leave, talk with our comrades at the front desk. We have many things coming up for you in the next weeks.
Thanks, Leah. Thank you.
Thank you.